How you doing, good people? This is the 8-Bit Animal. Okay, so Nintendo, we all know that they, for better or for worse, saved the gaming industry in the U.S. in the 80s. The Nintendo Entertainment System sold about somewhere around 40 million plus units. It featured some of the most iconic titles in gaming history, from Mega Man to Mario Brothers, Castlevania, Double Dragon, Battletoads, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, DuckTales. All of these iconic video games appeared on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And so, 5 years into the NES's life, it was faced with its first real challenge from the Sega Genesis. Well, Nintendo decides, okay, 5 years is enough. It's time for us to move on. Nintendo in 1990 in Japan releases their 16-bit console, their entry into the war, into the 16-bit arms race, as some called it. That console was actually vastly superior in graphics to the Sega Genesis and the PC Engine in Japan, also known as the TurboGrafx 16. But we'll talk about that console later. And so Nintendo decides, okay, it's time to bring this console to the US and to Europe. And it's renamed from the Super Famicom, which it was called in Japan. Pretty much an update of the family computer or Famicom console that was Nintendo's bread and butter from 1983 to that point. And in the US, we got the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, the Super Nintendo was a beast of a console for that time. It was graphically superior to the Sega Genesis. It featured Mode 7 scrolling. It could do parallax scrolling. The games were more colorful. They featured a bigger color palette. You could fit more characters on screen. So a game like, say, Double Dragon on the NES, you wouldn't have had the problem where only two enemies could show up on screen at a time, and they had to be twins. You could have more enemies on screen, things like that. And so the NES kind of didn't have a huge buzz as far as, everybody clamoring to find out what games were going to be released. Because we knew one thing about the Super NES, and that was the pack-in title. And that pack-in title was Super Mario World. This pushed the Super Nintendo because it was the follow-up to the ridiculously successful Super Mario Brothers 3. It was one of the biggest platformers to date at that point. It was 96 levels. And we found out later on that it was actually a lot bigger than 96 levels. But the combination of this innovative console and this incredible platformer, coupled with a marketing campaign that let these kids know, look, you have this Nintendo Entertainment System at your house, but you need a Super Nintendo. That was pretty much the driving force behind Nintendo retaking the 16-bit, well, retaking the game market from the threat of Sega, beating back the advance of the Sega Genesis, and pretty much winning the console war for Nintendo. At that point, at least. This would prove to be the last time that Nintendo won a console generation in terms of sales. Since then, Nintendo has had issues with trying to kind of play catch up as far as technology is concerned. But it's good to look back at the Super Nintendo because it was one of those consoles that really got the conversation going, as far as which console is better, who had the better console. Was Nintendo's console better than Sega's? Was Sega's console better than Nintendo's? And it started that conversation, but unfortunately it gave rise to fanboys, and we know how I feel about fanboys. Because at the end of the day, consoles are consoles, but consoles don't matter if they don't have good games to back them up. Thankfully, the Super NES and the Genesis both had excellent games on them, as well as the TurboGrafx 16. But again, we'll get to the TurboGrafx 16 a little bit later in this series. This has been the 8-Bit Animal, and I will talk to you beautiful people tomorrow.